You pay your water bill every single month, and you don't think twice about it, because that's just what people do now. You watch the meter run when you rinse a dish, and some part of you flinches. You've seen the watering restriction signs go up on your street during a dry summer, telling you which days you're allowed to touch your own lawn. And you think this is just how it's always been, that water comes from a pipe, and the pipe belongs to the city, and that's the end of the conversation. I want to stop you right there, because my father never had a water bill in his life, not one. And he raised a family, watered stock, kept a garden through droughts that would make today's water restrictions look like a light drizzle. And he never once wrote a check to anybody for the rain that fell on his own roof. This is not invention. This is recovery. Everything I'm going to tell you today, some family in this country was already doing it before the Depression ever hit, and doing it because they had no other choice. Let me tell you who I am, because you should know where this comes from before you trust a word of it. My name's Reuben. I'm a rancher, same as my father was, same as his father was before him, out on land that sat right in the middle of what folks now call the Dust Bowl. My grandfather worked that ground through the drought years of the 1930s, when the topsoil itself picked up and left the state without asking anybody's permission. Black blizzards, they called them. Dust storms so thick you couldn't see your own barn from the porch. 300 million tons of good soil, just gone, blown clean off the plains because the land had been stripped bare in the 1920s, cut open by machines that plowed faster than the old horse-drawn methods ever could, tearing out the deep-rooted native grass that had held that soil in place for longer than anybody could remember. When the rain stopped coming in 1931, there was nothing left to hold the ground down. My grandfather didn't read about conservation in a pamphlet. He lived through the reason conservation had to exist. And what he learned out of pure necessity got taught to my father, who taught it to me, standing in the same yard, using the same hands-on method, no classroom, no manual, just watching an old man do a thing and being expected to do it right the next time. So here's my promise to you today, plain and simple. I'm going to show you 4 things my family did with water that most Americans have completely forgotten how to do. None of it costs much. None of it requires permission from anybody, once you understand where the real lines are drawn. And I'll be honest with you about those lines, because half the nonsense floating around on the internet about this topic is exaggerated past the point of truth. And I'm not going to be the next person feeding you a lie just because it sounds exciting. What I will tell you could save you real money, could give you water when the tap runs dry, and could make you a little less dependent on a system that, frankly, hasn't always had your best interest in mind. Here's the first secret, and it's the one everybody gets wrong before they even start. Most folks think collecting rainwater off their own roof is illegal. Flat out illegal, everywhere, all 50 states. I've heard grown men say it like it's gospel. It is not true, and the old ranch families would laugh you out of the kitchen for believing it. Here's what's actually true. Catching rain off a rooftop into a barrel or a cistern is legal in every single state in this country. What varies, and this is where people get confused, is how much you can store and whether you need to register it. Colorado, for instance, used to have one of the strictest rules in the nation, practically banning it outright, until a law passed in 2016 that opened it back up. Now a homeowner there can keep up to 110 gallons across 2 barrels for outdoor use. Utah allows up to 2,500 gallons total once you register with the state. Under that, in a couple of small covered containers, you don't need to register at all. Nevada allows it for single-family homes. That's it. That's the whole supposedly terrifying list people scream about online. A small handful of states with modest storage limits, not some nationwide ban keeping decent people from catching rainwater. My mother had a cistern behind the house, fed straight off the roof gutters, holding water she used for the garden and for washing all summer long. Nobody ever came to take it away. The old people knew the difference between catching what falls from the sky onto your own roof and reaching out to grab water that belongs to somebody else. That difference is the whole secret, and I'll come back to it, because it matters more than people realize. Here's the second secret, and this one's about the ground itself, not the sky. Here is what most folks get wrong. They think water conservation means using less water. It doesn't. It means losing less water. There's a difference, and the old Dust Bowl families understood it because they had to. When the drought hit in '31 and the ground turned to powder, my grandfather and men like him started plowing along the contour of the land instead of straight up and down the slope. Every furrow became a little dam, catching rain before it could run off and take the topsoil with it. They planted their crop stubble back into the ground instead of clearing it clean, because a layer of old plant matter on top of the soil stops rain from just beating the dirt into a hard crust that water slides right off of. Some families went further and dug what they called grass waterways, natural drainage lines seeded thick with deep-rooted grass, so the water moving downhill had something to pass through besides bare dirt, which kept the channel from turning into a gully overnight. Others planted long rows of trees, what the government called shelter belts, to break the wind before it ever got a chance to pull moisture out of the topsoil in the first place. The government eventually organized a piece of this into something official. The Soil Conservation Service, started in 1935 under a man named Hugh Hammond Bennett, who understood the science of it better than most, and by 1937, states were forming local conservation districts run by the landowners themselves, not by Washington. But my grandfather wasn't waiting on any of that. He was already doing it, because a man watching his soil blow away in front of him doesn't need a government pamphlet to tell him something's wrong. The physics has not changed. Water that's allowed to run off the surface of your land is water you've lost for good. Water that soaks into ground covered by mulch or caught by a contour furrow stays where you can use it. That's not a trick. That's just paying attention to where the water wants to go and giving it a reason to stay. Now here's the third secret, and this is the one where I need you to really listen, because this is where the legal reality gets serious, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There is a real difference between catching rain off your roof and damming up a stream that runs through your property. The old stock ponds ranch families built, small ponds dug to water cattle and horses, those are still legal in most every state and still built the same way today. A Wyoming man named Andy Johnson dug one on his own 9-acre property in 2012, got a proper permit from the state engineer, did everything right by his own state's law, and the federal government still came after him under the Clean Water Act, threatening him with fines that climbed past $20 million before backing down in 2016 once it became clear the law actually exempted stock ponds all along. That man did nothing wrong. He just got caught in a fight between state permission and federal overreach, and it took public pressure and a good lawyer to sort it out. But there's another case, and this one's different, and I want you to understand why. A man in Oregon named Gary Harrington built 3 large earthen dams across natural drainage channels on his 170-acre property, holding back roughly 40 acre-feet of water. That's around 13 million gallons, enough to fill nearly 20 Olympic swimming pools. Water that by Oregon law since 1909 belonged to the public, and specifically to a nearby city's water supply. He wasn't collecting rain off a roof. He was blocking a public stream. He'd already been warned once in 2002 and pled guilty again a few years later and kept refilling the dams anyway. In 2012, a judge sentenced him to 30 days in jail and ordered the ponds drained. Here is where people make the mistake. They hear, a man went to jail over water, and they assume it was for a rain barrel. It wasn't. It was for damming a public stream after being told not to more than once. The old ranch families understood this line instinctively. Because their whole system of water rights out west was built on a principle called prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. Water that touches the ground and flows into a stream belongs to whoever has the oldest legal claim to it, and taking more than your share, without permission, has consequences that go back over 100 years. Water that falls on your own roof and never reaches that stream is a different matter entirely. Nobody had to tell my grandfather where that line was. He knew it the way he knew which fence was his and which fence belonged to the neighbor. Now let me give you the fourth secret, because most people forget this one entirely, and it's maybe the most practical of the bunch: the shallow well. Before rural water lines reached most ranch country, families dug or drove their own wells, and to this day, most states still allow small domestic wells without a formal water rights permit, provided you stay under a certain volume. Washington State, for example, exempts small domestic wells pulling up to 5,000 gallons a day, along with watering a garden under half an acre or giving stock a drink. Montana exempts wells that pull 35 gallons a minute or less, so long as you don't go over 10 acre-feet a year, though starting in 2026, they'll want a simple notice filed before you start digging. That's not some crushing bureaucracy, that's a form. My great-uncle hand-dug a well on his section during the 30s because the closest municipal line was better than 20 miles off, and there was no such thing as waiting for the county to solve his problem. He hit water at maybe 18 feet, lined the shaft with stone, and that well served 2 households for better than 40 years. A modern version of that isn't hand-digging with a shovel. Most folks today hire a licensed driller, and it isn't cheap, running anywhere from about $15 to $30 a foot, depending on where you live and what's under your ground. But once it's in, and once you've checked your state's exemption rules, you've got water that no drought restriction on a city system can touch, because it was never the city's water to restrict in the first place. Now let me talk about why most of this disappeared from ordinary American life. Because it's not some scandal, and I don't want you walking away thinking there was a conspiracy. There wasn't. It was simply a system nobody had to coordinate. After the war, rural electrification spread across the country. Municipal water systems got built out to towns that never had them, and suddenly turning a tap was easier than maintaining a cistern, a rain barrel, a well, and a contour-plowed field. Convenience wins, every time, in the short run. Families stopped teaching their children how to catch and store their own water because there was no longer an obvious reason to. My own children grew up with a hose bib and a water bill, same as most of you. Knowledge doesn't get banned, it just gets set down and forgotten, one generation at a time, until nobody remembers picking it up in the first place. Even the universities that trained agricultural agents moved on from teaching contour plowing by hand level and started teaching it by GPS and satellite mapping. The knowledge didn't vanish, it just moved into places most families never think to look, tucked into extension office manuals instead of passed down at the supper table. So let's talk about doing this yourself, plainly, because I promised you something you could actually use. For roof catchment, you want food-grade plastic barrels, 55 gallons each, running you somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $35 a piece, second-hand, fitted with a simple diverter off your downspout and a mesh screen on top to keep out debris and mosquitoes. 2 barrels, connected, gets you past 100 gallons of free water after almost any decent rain, and stays under Colorado's limit, if that's where you live, though most states won't even ask you to think about a limit at all. Check your own state's rule before you go bigger than a few hundred gallons, because that's where registration sometimes comes into play. For contour planting in a garden or small field, you don't need machinery. A simple line level and a bit of patience will let you trace the natural contour of a slope by eye, and mulching your beds with straw or old plant matter after harvest costs you nothing but the labor of not clearing it away. If you've got a natural low spot where water already tends to run, seeding it with a dense, Deep-rooted grass, instead of mowing it bare, will do more for you in one season than any amount of complaining about drainage. For a stock pond or any larger surface water project, that's the one place I tell you plainly. Go talk to your state water engineer first, same as Andy Johnson did. It's not expensive, it's not slow in most states, and it's the difference between owning your water and losing it in court. And for a well, talk to a licensed driller and your state's water resources office before you break ground, because the exemption thresholds are specific. Gallons per day, gallons per minute, acre-feet per year, and they're worth 5 minutes of a phone call before you spend real money. Now, the honest math, and I want to walk you through this slower than I did before, because I don't want you thinking I'm selling you something. 100 gallons of stored rainwater might save you somewhere in the range of a few dollars a month on a city bill, depending on your local rate. This isn't going to replace your water supply entirely, and I won't tell you it will. 2 barrels, built for maybe $60 to $80 total, including the diverter kit, will pay for themselves over a couple of years, just in small savings, and then keep giving you water for free after that, same as they did for my mother for decades. A contour-plowed garden costs you nothing but time, and maybe a bag of mulch, and the return shows up as fewer wilted plants and less watering during a dry stretch, which is savings you feel more than you calculate. A shallow domestic well is the biggest investment of the 4, often running into the thousands of dollars once you count drilling, casing, and a pump. But it is also the one that keeps producing water during a drought when your neighbors are under mandatory restrictions, because it was never part of the municipal system to begin with. Where this really pays off is not in the monthly bill. It's during a dry spell, a boil water notice, or a week when the well pump fails on the county system and you've still got water sitting in a barrel for the garden and the animals, or a well of your own that answers to nobody but you. The old system was never about being cheaper on paper. It was about never being stuck with nothing. And there are limits, and I'll give them to you straight, because honesty is worth more to you than excitement. Roof catchment works best where you get regular rain. It won't save a family in true desert country, where the roof might go weeks without a drop worth collecting. Contour plowing needs slope to matter. It does little on flat ground, and grass waterways need enough room to actually establish before they'll hold. A cistern needs cleaning. A barrel needs a screen checked every season for mosquito larvae, and a well needs a working pump and, eventually, testing for water quality. None of this replaces a well in a serious long-term drought, and none of it is a substitute for basic maintenance. This isn't magic. It's upkeep, same as anything worth keeping. My mother used to stand at that cistern pump in July, filling a bucket for the tomatoes, and she'd tell me the same thing every summer. Water's not free, but it doesn't have to be expensive either, if you're willing to catch it yourself, instead of waiting for somebody to sell it back to you. My great-uncle said something similar about that well of his, less poetic but just as true. He said a man who digs his own water never has to ask permission to drink. I'd like to hear from you now. What did your family do for water, back before it all came out of a pipe? Did your grandparents have a cistern, a rain barrel, a shallow well, a stock pond out behind the barn? Is there anybody left in your family who still remembers how it worked, or did that knowledge stop with them? Tell me in the comments, because I read every one of them, and I'd like to know this knowledge is still alive in more houses than just mine. Next time, I'll show you how the same generation that solved their water problem also kept a house cool through a 110-degree Dust Bowl summer without a single electric fan running, and it's simpler than you'd think. There's an old well bucket that still hangs in my barn, rope gone stiff, wood gone gray. Nobody's drawn water with it in decades, but I keep it hanging there anyway, because it reminds me that my grandfather never once felt poor for not having a faucet. He felt prepared. The old Americans knew something valuable. We simply stopped remembering.